first of all, why should anybody campaign? Christians are humans like everyone else. Why should anybody campaign? And the first answer to that really is that for all of the practical action and lifestyle actions we may take, and it's right that we take them out of integrity and so on, only governments have the power, the resources, the legitimacy to do the things that urgently need doing and at scale to resolve the climate and nature crises. We can do a lot, and we should individually, but we need to be really, really clear that the scale of the emergency requires governments to spend money in the right way, to tax in the right way, to regulate, to pass laws, to sign international agreements. And you and I can't do any of those things. It's only governments that have the power and the legitimacy to do those things. Only governments also can stop people doing the wrong things. We can't determine that the government stops spending our taxes on fossil fuel. Only the government can determine that, for example. So we have to get governments to act. There is no other way out of these crises of climate and nature except by the government acting. That's not the only thing that needs to happen, but it will need to happen. So that's the first thing. The second thing is why Christians in particular, have we got any particular role in this? And I would say definitely for two reasons. There's the moral one. We have a biblical double mandate, as we say, to act on God's creation, both because he created it and loves it and wants us to care for it too. Just read Genesis if you're in any doubt. But secondly, because we are called upon to love our neighbor. And we now know, of course, that if the climate is undermined, if people lose their soil, if they lose their water, and so on, then we're undermining their ability to survive. So climate and the decline of the natural world are undermining our neighbors' ability to live. So we've got that biblical mandate. It's right that we act on these issues, and campaigning is, as I've said, a legitimate means of acting on these issues. But it's not just it's right. There is a really big need, an urgent need for influential sectors of society to do everything they can urgently to head off these crises. And the church and Christians are potentially incredibly powerful actor in this. Just consider this. There are 50,000 churches in the UK, in every village, neighborhood, city, and so on. Between us, we are 2 to 3 million individuals, depending on whose statistics you want to believe and how it's defined. What if even only a quarter of churches or a quarter of Christians actually took action on this issue, stood up publicly and said we need the government to go further, faster? We would be an incredibly big influence on politicians locally and nationally. So there is huge potential for the churches to make a very big practical difference on this really critical issue in this really critical decade. So that's an answer I'd give to that one. We could make a huge difference if we did. Not everybody can. Now, let me turn to the third question. Why climate and nature? Now, if you're a long-standing member of a Rocha, you won't need any convincing that we need to be working on nature. That's what a Rocha does. But it's become increasingly apparent that the climate and the nature crises are intimately linked. They're linked in all sorts of ways. First of all, the drivers of climate change and nature loss have a lot in common: overconsumption. They're caused in many ways by the same things. The second thing, there's mutual impacts. So, for example, destroying the climate is increasingly making it hard for nature, having an impact on nature. Looking at, for example, in the UK, species increasingly moving north as the country gets hotter. But actually, if they're highland species, where do they go? Mountains stop. They can't go any higher. So that's just one example of how climate is impacting nature. But actually, nature can impact climate too. The more we destroy our carbon sinks, our forests, our wetlands, our grasslands, the harder it is for the earth to absorb greenhouse gases back safely into the soil. So there are mutual impacts of these crises, but there's also mutual solutions. So stopping the extraction of fossil fuel, for example, would not only be good for climate change, actually Oil exploration, gas exploration is a major cause of pollution of our rainforests, of our seas, and so on. Likewise, as I've already said, restoring our carbon sinks would be really good, not just for climate change, it would be really good for nature, increasing habitats for species and so on. So there's big co-benefits of acting on these things. And that's why we're saying increasingly as a Rocha, we're a conservation organization. That is where our specialism is. We do not pretend to be a bunch of climate scientists, but we believe the science. We know it's having a massive impact on nature. And with our small capacity, it makes a lot of sense now to focus our efforts on those solutions that can work for both climate and nature. And interestingly enough, although we took that decision 2-3 years ago now, very recently, only a few weeks ago, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change came out and said there can be no solution to climate change without addressing natural decline, natural destruction. And there can be no solution to natural destruction, nature's decline, without addressing climate change. So it's kind of official. Somebody, somewhere, has got to deal with both. It doesn't mean to say we all have to campaign on both simultaneously, but it makes sense to campaign on those things that are solutions to both and to stop the things that are drivers of both crises. So that's what we're doing. So I hope that will give you some answers when people say to you, what are you doing campaigning on this as a Christian?